So this is an introduction to animal kingdom. So which one of these guys are animals? They're all of them. So in order to be considered an animal, you have to be heterotrophic, eukaryotic, multicellular, and you have to lack cell walls. So 95% of the animals are actually invertebrates and only 5% are vertebrates. So this is just a little recap. So biology, study of life. Physiology, study of function. Anatomy, study of structure. And zoology is study of. So let's talk about how organisms have to eat. So you can be heterotrophic, you can be herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, or detritivore. Or sometimes you can be a filter feeder like this sponge or shark. So a parasite, which we've already talked about, is something that lives in or on another. You have to be able to respire, lungs, gills, or skin, take in oxygen, and CO2. So a lot of small animals rely on diffusion when it's talking about their circulatory system. The main organ that actually is for secretion is your kidney, and most of the primary waste is. You have to be able to have a nervous system and be able to respond to. And number 6, you have to be able to move, so you can move in a variety of ways, and some animals just don't move. So what's the difference between a quadruped versus a bipedal, or a terrestrial versus aquatic, or sessile versus motile? Well, quad means 4, bi means 2. So 4-legged versus 2-legged. Terrestrial means land, aquatic means water, sessile means not to be able to move, and motile means to move. And the last characteristic is you have to be able to reproduce. So I want you to take a couple minutes and see if you can figure out this quick check. So a basking shark obtains its food by filter feeding. Animals that eat plants and others is a omnivore. Animals that live inside of one another is called a parasite. The study of function is physiology. Animals that feed on dead or decaying matter is a detritivore or decomposer. Animals can respire with their lungs, gills, or through their skin. Sexual reproduction actually increases genetic diversity. What is the main organ of excretion? And that's the kidneys. The study of animals is called zoology, and responses occur as a result of a stimulus. So you have to be able to feed, you have to be able to move, you have to be able to respond, you have to be able to circulate, you have to be able to reproduce, you have to be able to breathe as well as excrete. So the body segment. So there's 3 different ones. So asymmetry is no pattern. Radial symmetry is a wheel, as well as bilateral. Bilateral has a left. So I want you to identify it. So this nudibranch up at the top, this is bilateral. The anemone on the bottom left is radial. Your chimp in the middle is bilateral. Your sponge up here at the top right is your asymmetry, and the bottom right, which is your sea star, is radial. So cephalization means to have a head. So this octopus is a part of the cephalopoda, which means head foot. So anterior is towards your head, posterior is towards your back, or towards your tail. Dorsal is your back, and ventral is your belly. So we actually do have segments. We have segments because of our ribs and our spine. So how every single animal began was through a zygote. So once the zygote is developed, it turns into a blastula, which is a hollow ball of cells. So the blastula gets pinched inward, and it turns into 3 different germ layers: the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. The ectoderm forms your skin, meso is more for your muscles, and the endoderm is for everything inside. So if you are a protostome, that means that your mouth is developed first, and a deuterostome means your anus is developed first. So out of the 2, which one do you think we are? We are actually a deuterostome. And how you can remember it? Deuterostome, doo-doo, sounds like anus. So the kingdoms that we're going to talk about is Porifera, which are sponges, Cnidarians, which are Palaminthes are flatworms, nematodes are roundworms, annelids are worms, mollusks are your clams and your squid. Arthropoda, which is the largest section. This is your insects in your spine. Echinoderms are and phylum Chordata, which are all your vertebrates. So let's talk about Porifera versus Cnidaria first. So again, the sponges are actually animals. They're multicellular. They have no organs or body systems. They are heterotrophic and they're metric. They're sessile, means they can't move, but they do feed plankton, or they filter feed plankton. So they can reproduce sexually or asexually, and spongin is the soft part of their skeleton and spiracles are their hard part. So the spongin is what you actually, if you use a real sponge to bathe with, that's the spongin that you're bathing. So this is just an illustration about some different sponge anatomy parts. So the cnidarians, they actually have nematocysts, which are stinging cells that are tentacles. So you have your nematocysts, which are your barbs. That actually has your stinging cells, if you will, and basically the barbs actually inject themselves into the prey, and that's where the venom is going to occur, which it's going to paralyze their prey. They do have a gastrovascular cavity, which is kind of like a stomach, if you will. So they pretty much all of them have radiation. There's two different body forms. You have the polyp, which is like a vase, or you have your medusa, or a cup shape. This is one of the most dangerous nematocysts that we have out here, which is the Portuguese man-o'-war. It actually floats on top, kind of like a balloon, floats on the surface of the water, and it actually has, some of the tentacles can be over 50 feet long. So I want you to watch this clip from Nemo. The hydras are a polyp, and they do have radial symmetry, and they are really neat because they actually do somersaults in order to move. So coral reefs are very beautiful because they're made of the skeletons of cnidarians. So this is just a picture of a coral. So flatworms versus roundworms. Planarias are flat, roundworms, nematodes. So they have three characteristics. They have three germ layers, they're bisymmetry, and they have a station, which they do have a head. So the cloam is a fluid-filled cavity. Flatworms do not have that. So most of them are parasites. They do have a brain-like structure called a ganglia, and they do have eye spots. Most of them are hermaphrodites, but some of them can reproduce asexually. So the first worm is your planaria. This is a free-living flatworm, and it can be in freshwater or marine water. So this guy is actually a scavenger because he feeds mostly on, or he can feed mostly on prey. So a tapeworm. Tapeworms actually have to live in a host, and they have to absorb the host nutrition. So the scolex is the suckers, or the hooks that they attach, and the proletids, these are body segments of. Flukes have two different hosts. They have an intermediate host, which is in the snail, and then the primary host is us. So this is a life cycle of the flatworm. So take a couple minutes and look at it. So some human diseases are trichinosis. This is eating raw pork. Hookworm is like this person has. They walked barefooted. Tapeworm you can get from contaminated food, and most roundworms you can get from either food or pet. So this is a picture of just a blockage due to the numerous amounts of roundworm. So most roundworms live in the intestines, but they can move and they can migrate, like this roundworm has, inside of the eye. So this is a small clip of the life cycle. So take a couple minutes and I want you to practice to see what you know. So type of flatworm that is free living. That's E. planaria. Type of flatworm that lives in the intestines. That's D. the tapeworm. Roundworm that has a snail as an immediate host. That's B. Disease you get from eating uncooked pork. That's A. And the worm that you can get from contaminated soil, which is C. the hookworm. So this is the roundworm. And roundworms are unsegmented worms. They have a false cloam. Okay, but they do have a body cavity that contains them. So this is the first of our invertebrates that actually have a mouth and an anus. They can feed in multiple different ways. So they can be either free living, such as predators, or they can also be parasites. They can, these guys do reproduce sexually, so they do have separate sexes, male and female. So just like we talked about before with the flatworms, trichinosis actually is from eating uncooked meat. So another disorder is elephantitis that is actually transmitted by a vector, which is a mosquito. So the common roundworm, these are the ones that are passed down in feces. So this is the one that your dogs and cats can get. And you can also get them too if you do not use preventatives, heartworm pills or worm preventatives, period. Hookworms, we talked about those. Those actually attach and suck blood. So the very first organism that we ever sequenced was actually a roundworm. So the annelids are duster worms, earthworms, and leeches. They're pretty much everywhere. They do have segments. They do have a mouth and anus. They do have a well-developed brain and static skeleton, which basically uses fluids or blood in order to. So they have these things called CDs, which help aid. Some of them have parapodas, which are basically more flattened or flashed, like this parapoda. So there's 3 different classes. Talk about the earthworms first. They have no parapoda. They do have CDs. These are the earthworms. And they do have an anterior and posterior ends. And they do have a bilateral left and right side. So they also have cephalization, and they have a special satellite structure that has eggs and sperm. So they're detritivores, so they consume organic matter. They do have a pharynx, which actually helps to suck in the food. They have a crop for storage, a gizzard for grinding, and then the intestines for digestion. The cast, what comes out of the anus is the waste. They have a closed circulatory system, so they do have blood vessels and they have hearts. They have mucus that keeps them warm and very moist. So they're very sensitive to light, touch, moisture, chemicals, temperature, and vibrations. Because of their simple brain, they do not have any eyes, but they do have a nerve cord. They are hermaphrodites. Some of them can be sexual. So the leeches, they have no CDs or parapoda. They have an anterior and posterior suckers. They can either be scavengers or parasites. So they have teeth that will actually attach and suck the host blood. So some of them are for medical uses, so for removing your polychaetes. These are your paddle-like. They do have paddles, which are parapoda, and they are marine. Okay, they do live in a commensalism relationship with a lot of sponges, mussels, mollusks, as well as echinoderms. And they do have a specialized head with antennas and parts. So this is the clam worm. This is the marine worm that you see the most. So the mollusk. The mollusks are snails, slugs, oysters, clams, octopus, and squid. So they're soft-bodied. They have a mantle. Some of them have a shell. They're the second largest phylum, and they do have a muscular foot, and some of them have antennas. Again, they do have a one-way digestive tract, mouth to anus. They do have cephalization, but some of them have a radula, which is a very sharp tongue that they use to scrape off things. Every single one of them, doesn't matter what they are, they have a tetherophore, which is this illustration, this type of larvae stage. So it doesn't matter if you're a clam, an oyster, a scallop, or a mussel, you're going to have this particular type of larvae structure. So the mollusks are marine. Some of them can be freshwater, and some of them can also even be terrestrial. So how do we use them? We use them for jewelry, such as pearls, for food, and for buttons. So some of the pests are the hosts that we have. Some of them can actually damage our gardens, and then some of them can damage our ships. And the worst one actually is our zebra mussel that has wreaked havoc on the Great Lake ecosystem. There's 3 different parts. You've got your muscular foot, your visceral mask, and your mantle. They do have separate sexes. Some of them have very well-developed heads and eyes, as you can see in the scallops as well as the squid and the octopi. So again, I talked about that radula. That radula is that sharp tongue, and they do have several rows of teeth on that sharp tongue. So some of them have shells that are made out of calcium carbonate, which is the same stuff that's made of limestone. So they do have an open circulatory system. Their visceral mass is actually just where their body organs are. Some of them have gills and some of them have lungs in order to respire. So again, they do have a separate sex. Some can be hermaphrodites, but all of them have to go through that larvae stage that trochophore. So the first class that we're going to talk about is a gastropod. These ones are your snails, slugs, sea hares, sea slugs, and sea butterflies. They can be in all locations, marine, freshwater, or terrestrial. But the slugs just lack a shell. So gastropoda, they are univalve, so that means they have one shell. And some of them have a horny operculum, which is this where they can actually withdraw themselves and protect themselves from predators. So most of them are herbivores, and some of them can be scavengers, but even some of them can be carnivores that they actually drill into and consume other mollusks. So bivalve has 2 shells. These are your mussels, clams, oysters, scallops, as well as shipworms, and they're sessile and filter feeders. They don't have a head or a radula. They do have 2 shells, and they have a hinge that actually opens and shuts their shell. So they have 2 siphons to pump in water and exit water. This is for gas exchange, feeding, and jet propulsion. So most of the bivalves actually have a muscular foot, but the scallops can actually clap their shells together to create jet propulsion. So they have an open circulatory system. Again, they can use their gills to filter feed as well as respire. So like we said before, the scallops actually have small rows of blue eyes that actually are very advanced and can see pretty well. So the cephalopods are your octopi, your squid, nautilus, and cuttlefish. Pretty much they are marine, and they also are carnivores. They have a beak-like jaw that actually they use to crush, but their foot is actually turned into tentacles. So the nautilus is really neat. It's the only one that actually has an external shell out of the cephalopods, and basically the shell is made to create buoyancy using gas chambers. So the cuttlefish is kind of like a squattier version of a squid. It's pretty old. It does have a curved shell that's enclosed inside the mantle. So inside the squid, they have a pin, which is kind of like a flexible backbone, if you will. So the cephalopods can expel water by swimming through basically a funnel. They do have complex eyes, they have the largest brain, and they do have a closed circulatory system. All of them have chromatophores, which are pigment cells that actually can change and blend into their background for camouflage. They do use jet propulsion to help escape, or some of them can use ink. They do have separate sexes, and These ones are very diverse. They mean spiny skin. They can live pretty much anywhere. And these are your starfish, your brittle stars, sand dollars. So they are bilateral, or excuse me, their bilateral larvae stage turns into a radial adult stage. They do have pental radial, which most of them have 5 limbs or more. They do have an endoskeleton, which they have protruding spines as well. So they have 2 feet that help assist with pretty much all of their systems. They don't have a head and they don't have a brain. They can or so the lily-like, these are your star lilies and feather stars. These ones are sessile, and they basically use their sticky tube feet to attach and gather. The star-like, these are the sea stars or the starfish. They're pretty much all over the world. They prey on other. The snake-like is our largest. This is actually your basket stars and your brittle stars. And they primarily are found in coral reefs. So the reason why we call them brittle stars is because they have brittle arms that will break off, but they can regenerate themselves. The hedgehog-like, this is your sand dollars and your sea urchins. They have an endoskeleton that they also have this device called an Aristotle's lantern, and basically it's a very complex jaw-like mechanism that they use to grind up food. So they have 2 feet of well, but these are the only ones that have large extended barbs, and these barbs can sometimes be the sand dollars are they lived in coastal areas. They're flat. They do have the ability to burrow themselves in the bottom. Those 2 feet. So the sea cucumbers are our last group, and they have soft bodies. They use their tentacles in order to sweep up sediment, so they're actually tridivores. And their protection is called evisceration, which basically what it means is they actually eject their internal organs through their anus to kind of play possum. But if they do, again, lose any parts, they can regenerate themselves. So our next group is our Arthropoda. This is the largest phylum that we have known to man. That's actually over 1 million species altogether. So the main difference is we notice that if a group has many forms and different types and appearances, we have the greatest diversity. So can you name any arthropods that you know? So their main characteristic is that they have to have jointed appendages. Okay, Arthropoda literally means jointed foot. They have an exoskeleton, and they have a body. So the exoskeleton provides support as well as for structure, but they cannot grow without molting. So they have to molt, like this picture below. So mandibles are their special chewing parts. Side. They all go through metamorphosis of some shape, size, or form. So they start with an egg, they turn into a larvae, and then eventually to. So how are maggots actually even used in medicine? I want you to check out this clip and see what you can think. So there's 3 different kinds of subphylums. So the first subphylum is our spiders, ticks, and scorpions. They have 2 body segments. They have a cephalothorax, which basically means head and chest together, an abdomen, as well as 8 legs and no antennas. So the spiders actually belong to a special division called arachnids. So they have 3 different types of spider parts. We have the specialized mouth parts that are used for biting. That's what the name comes from. The pedipalps, these ones are appendages that actually help manipulate prey, and the spinnerets are there to use to stabs. The next group is our crustaceans. These are our shrimp, lobsters, crabs, and crawfish, or crawdaddies, if you will. We have 4 pairs of legs, 2 claws, and 2 pairs of antennae. So the difference between a centipede and a centipede actually is one pair of leg per segment, and a millipede actually has two pairs per segment. And the major difference between a centipede and a millipede is a centipede is actually predators and they're poisonous, and a millipede is a herbivore. So you want to make sure that you stay away from those centipedes. And those roly-polies, those millipedes, they're good to handle. Your insect is 3 pairs of legs, you have 1 pair of antennae, and 3 body segments. So you do have that separation of body segments where there's a head, a thorax, and so let's talk about the different classes of insecta. So you have bees, ants, and wasps that go in one, beetles, crickets, and grasshoppers, damselflies and dragonflies, stick and leaf insects like the stick bug here to the right. So let's talk about some ticks. So ticks can carry, again, like we discussed, centipedes. The tarantulas are actually pretty docile, and that's why most people can actually handle them. So a lot of insects use mimicry. So this is actually not a wasp, this is a fly. So we already talked about the differences when we talked about our monarch butterflies. So they both look alike, but the one to the left is actually a moth and the one to the right is a butterfly. So butterflies always rest with their wings up. Moths rest with their wings flat. So the brown recluse is the #1 spider that's most common in houses here in the United States, but it's the most deadly because it can cause death of your tissue. So the black widow is also pretty dangerous. It can also cause neurosis, which is death of the tissue. But the way you can identify this one is it has to have an hourglass, a red hourglass on its abdomen. Termites are just like ants. They're very social. Head lice is actually a parasite, so please do not share your house. The female fly can also not just consume 15 times its body weight in blood, but it also can jump up to 15 feet as well. And this is the cause of the plague. So beetles are the most diverse group of arthropods. And this is a scorpion where, if you can see, it has a specialized its extension on its abdomen for stinging purposes. And this is a spider crab, and you might also see these in the deeper waters of the North Pacific Ocean.